We're here today with Lauren Virgo, who is the Registrar of the Augusta Museum of History, and we're talking about face jugs. Face jugs are a very unique form that appeared in the Edgefield area of South Carolina in the early 19th century. Now, vessels with faces on are common to cultures throughout the world. I mean, going back thousands of years from Peru to recent times, 18th century in London. So lots of cultures make them. But these jugs are rather unique in as much as they've been noted for their crude manufacture, for the fierce energy that they display and the way they're put together. And there's been a lot of discussion about the purpose and the use of these particular jugs. The first one to come into the collections is this one right here. This is a cup that is attributed to the Davies pottery. Colonel Davies was a Civil War pottery manufacturer, and he noted in his diary that enslaved Africans on his pottery were making jugs with faces on, and he quotes, for their own purposes. And they weren't made as a part of the regular pottery production. They were made away from the main pottery and were for some purpose that the Africans alone knew about and used. They first began to appear in museum collections at about the turn of the 19th century. This particular piece, a cup, we now believe, based on research that we've done, was used for a process called cupping. This is something that comes directly from the Congo as a ritual practice. The reason we say that is because in 1858, a ship called the Wanderer brought 400 actually enslaved Africans into Georgia, 200 of whom came up into Edgefield and worked in the potteries. And it is from that date in 1858 that there was a sudden fluorescence of face jug forms in the potteries. And so the connection, we think, is undeniable. There were face jugs made in Edgefield prior to that date, but most of those were European in style and form, and they can be traced back to a potter called Chandler, who worked with the Remy pottery in Philadelphia, which made European-style face jugs. These jugs, appearing as they did after 1858, we believe were made by the Africans from the Wanderer and by other potters that emulated their practice. We now believe that it's part of a spiritual practice that these Congolese introduced back into the African American communities it was at that time. We've since been able to look at 30 or 40 of these jugs and determine that there were several distinct potteries that made them and several distinct potters that produced them as a style. If we look at this one here, Lauren, this is called a harvest jug or a water jug or a monkey jug. It has a very distinct type of neck and handle, and then again the face is very characteristic of this particular potter. This may have been used for water, but hardly likely that it would have been used for water in the field, probably more for a ritual purpose of some kind. This is probably a fairly early jug. In as much as we see this style on earlier jugs, we see the particular modeling of the face on other jugs, which we can determine early on, probably pretty soon after 1858. As opposed to the other jug in the museum's collection, and this is a very, very nice example of a nicely fired and manufactured jug with a nice green alkaline glaze. What is significant about this particular jug is that the eyes and the teeth are not white. They're densely covered in carbon. This may have happened in the kiln, or it may have happened afterwards if the object was exposed to smoke and palm oil and other things that would darken it. As we examine these jugs, we've begun to realize that there are very distinct markers for particular kinds of potters. the nose, the treatment of the mouth, for example, and the lips, even the ears, are all distinctive of a particular hand. So we know that there were several potters that made these, not just at the Davis Pottery, but also at other potters. Whilst these have turned up in collections, primarily in the Northeast, we never knew for a long time where they were actually made. The suspicion was that Davis was correct, that these were the jugs he was referring to and that they were made in Edgefield Potteries. Up until 2006, nobody really knew of any specific location where these pots were made. About that time, that is when these fragments were discovered at a site called the Bainham Pottery in Trenton, South Carolina. And as Davis mentioned, some distance away from the main pottery. Not far enough to be secretive, but far enough to be private, we found a small area of concentrated production where these face jugs were being made. There was an excavation of about 5 square meters. We did a total recovery, and many of the fragments were very, very tiny, smaller than my fingernail, and there was about 3,000 of those. And I'll go further into that. When I talk about these fragments, after they were published, that's when we got an exhibit together at Milwaukee Art Museum and found the jug with the Pofu sgraffito on it. It's not. One of the things we began to notice as we got to see more and more of these jugs is that there are some very distinct differences in style and in the way the faces are put together. If you look at the Harvest jug, for example, that is a jug that has a very distinct technique for the nose. The teeth treatment is very distinctive, as are the eyes, and the placement of the ears and the nose. This is very similar to several other jugs that we've seen in collections that are also made with an Albany slip, as this one is. And we think this is an earlier style of jug. If we look at the cup, as an alternative, this is much more crudely made and much more powerful in terms of the energy that has gone into the expression and the eyes. But one of the things that we began to notice is that this is a very common feature where portions of the face have come off during the firing process. And it's very evident here that the surface was not scored so that the eye and the eyelids would adhere properly to the cup. And that's without going into the purpose for these things, which we'll discuss again in a moment. If we look at the other jug that you have, this is an example of a very finished piece where the potter that made the base jug itself was quite skilled, and the glazing was skilled. The firing was well done. This is nicely glazed. But again, the eyes appear to be the work of a separate potter. And this is a theory that was pretty much confirmed when we started to find these fragments. Up until the discovery of these fragments, no one knew of any pottery where these were actually being made. Okay. We suspected, for instance, that the cup came from the Davis Pottery, that this particular piece might have come from the Bainham Pottery, but nobody knew for sure. Then in the 2006, we discovered a site where these were being made away from the main pottery. It's a 5 meter square area where we recovered 3,000 fragments, most of them smaller than my fingernail, very tiny, but 30 or 40 fragments were of this nature. And this began to give us a really good look at the manufacturing process. And again, we can see where eyes were popped off during the process, where the base vessel was not scored before the eye was added to it. This leads us to the conclusion that a skilled potter threw the base jug and then someone else added the facial features. Then we have to begin to ask why this was. And as we mentioned, in 1858, 200 enslaved Africans came into the potteries in Edgefield, and it's after that date that these jugs began to appear. What we think is happening is that these people were introducing Congolese spiritual practices into their lives in the pottery and into the African American community. These were second and third generation enslaved Africans that we can tell from the research had a very keen interest in their heritage and their history. So we think they would have absorbed these traditions from these Africans from the Wanderer very, very quickly. The Wanderer was the slave ship that brought these enslaved Africans to Georgia. And when we look at these fragments, we can then tell how they were manufactured, how they were put together. We can look at the different styles between the teeth and the eyes and the noses. They're all different, and we can very clearly tell that there is a hand here of several different potters. So we know now of at least 3 potteries where we think these were made. Definitely the Bainham pottery, certainly the Davies pottery, and possibly several other potteries in the area as well. The big question is to why? What were they used for? Why were they made? Davies said for their own purposes. The intimation is that there was some kind of ritual purpose behind these jugs. So after finding these and gathering other researchers, we began to look at more and more jugs. Finally, the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Art Museum, had a jug in their collection with sgraffito on the back. That sgraffito was the word P-O-F-U, and that's a Congolese word.
Okay.
And significantly, the eyes on that jug have been painted black, and the word Pofu is Congolese for to make blind. So we think there's clear evidence of a jug used for what would have been called conjuring purposes. It's the same with the cup that you have. Cupping was a practice that conjurers used to draw evil or illness or bad influences out of someone's body.
Okay.
And they would place the cup on the flesh, after a while pull it away, and amazingly there might be a lizard or a small snake underneath. And we have descriptions of this process from people that have actually seen it in their childhood. So we know that that was one of the things it was used for. Significantly, this cup has been holed in the bottom. A vessel of this nature, if it had been accidentally holed like that, would have shattered. We believe that this is a deliberate practice of making a hole which is ritually killing the vessel. And that might be because this was buried with the conjurer that used it.
Gotcha.
And so they're killing his magic and burying it with him. We find a lot of these jugs in African American graves today. So there is a connection there.
Are some of the jugs kept with the families?
Yes, and again in our research and interviews we found many families that still have these jugs. Their grandfathers have them and in basements, and we suspect there are a great many more out there, but they're still held in a measure of respect by the families that own them. Another practice we found was that they were commonly kept by doorways, entranceways, to protect the house, and we've seen that tradition everywhere from Aiken to Alabama.
Wow.
So it's clear there was a ritual use for these jugs, that they were most likely made by the Wanderer Africans when they came in 1858, and that then other African American potters picked up the tradition, and that eventually towards the turn of the 19th century, we'll begin to see white potters making face jugs. The Mark Bainham made face jugs, we know, and they were somewhat similar to these that were made on his pottery. So he doubtless saw fragments like this and made those particular jugs.
And what era was his pottery active?
Joseph Gregory Bainham began his pottery in 1872 and it closed in 1906.
Okay.
These fragments, we believe, were made between approximately 1860 and 1872 when Lewis Miles and his son John Lewis Miles owned the same pottery. And we have the records that show the transfer of the land through these people to Bainham. That's probably where the Georgia tradition of face jugs began, was here in Edgefield. We can now actually, we've done a lot of interviews in Edgefield County, we can trace some of those families in Edgefield County back to the Congo.
Wow.
One man in particular was named Ward Lee. He kept a record in his family, an oral record of his history. When he was 10, he was captured on the banks of the Zambezi River. His ankle was broken when they pulled a chain attached to his ankle to force him onto the boat. And we found that in records of some of the sailors on the Wanderer. They mentioned breaking a boy's ankle. And then when we interviewed the Bishop family in Edgefield, they were telling us, our great-great-grandfather's ankle was broken when he was dragged aboard the boat. Gosh. So we have that connection. And his name in Africa was Silukanji. So that's marvelous.
That is.
Many people in Edgefield have forgotten or don't know of their Wanderer origins. And again, we were able to meet with some people and actually tell them what their family history was, which was kind of fun to be able to do that too, and so important for these people to know. But there are many descendants from those 407 Africans scattered throughout the United States today. Some of those descendants are quite famous people, by the way. Yeah.
Do we know what happened to the other 200 enslaved Africans who were not brought up the Savannah River?
A researcher in Philadelphia by the name of April Hines did most of this background research and did a wonderful job in tracing through newspaper accounts what happened to many of those 407 people, and she will publish on that later on this year, I believe. She was able to trace many of them into Georgia, Alabama, even as far as New Orleans. Fascinating history, and a story that's yet to be told there.